The plane rumbled as it ascended into the sky, but for one elderly man there was no rush to the clouds. He sat by the window, staring out at the endless stretch of blue and white, far below, his eyes filled with an unsettling calmness, as if something inside him had gone still and silent, in sync with the smooth hum of the aircraft around him. The passengers were busy with the usual pre-flight rituals, some already buried in their books, some whispering quietly to each other as the flight attendant moved down the aisle efficiently handing out drinks and snacks, but no one paid much attention to the man. He had been quiet since boarding. His clothes were plain, a worn sweater and a pair of faded trousers. His hands rested on his lap, clutching the armrests tightly, as if he were holding on to something that only he could feel. The flight attendant noticed him now, and then her eyes would flicker to his seat, wondering why he hadn't said a word, or made a sound, not even when she asked him if he wanted anything to drink. At first it seemed like nothing more than a simple oversight, but soon she found herself growing more uncomfortable with his silence. She repeated the question twice. He made no motion, just sat there, staring out the window, his thin lips barely moving. She hesitated. Her instinct kicked in, irritation bubbling to the surface. She knew how it felt when people made her job harder. But this felt different. There was something about this man that was just off. He looked up slowly, catching her gaze, his eyes empty, as though they were fixed on something miles away, but not a word came from his mouth. She cleared her throat and tried again, this time raising her voice slightly. "Sir, can I get you something?" Her tone sharp, her patience running thin, but the man didn't respond. She frowned, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary, but she quickly moved on the feeling in her chest, nagging her, but she shoved it away to focus on the next row of passengers. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled deeper into her bones. Something about his quietness seemed unnatural, something that scratched at her instincts. The hum of the plane continued in the background, the steady rhythm of the engines a constant presence, but in the midst of the bustling cabin there was only the quiet man and his unshifting gaze. He was calm, too calm, for someone who had just boarded a plane with so many strangers. The flight attendant continued her duties, but the thought of him lingered like an itch she couldn't reach. She glanced back at him a few more times, but each time he was the same silent figure, staring out the window. Then a sudden jolt rocked the plane, sending a few startled gasps through the cabin. The flight attendant gripped the nearest seat back. As the lights flickered briefly, the man didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the sky, as if he knew exactly what was coming. That was when the unease turned to something else, something heavier, as if the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The other passengers muttered nervously, but still the man said nothing. The attendant's stomach twisted into knots as she made her way down the aisle again, this time her footsteps hesitant. She couldn't help but wonder if the man was somehow different than the others. Maybe she was just imagining it, maybe. But deep down something told her she wasn't. The flight attendant could feel her heartbeat pick up as she made her way down the aisle again, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her eyes kept darting back to the elderly man still sitting motionless by the window, his pale face illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the cabin, as though the very light was too much for him to bear. She had seen it before, people who didn't want to be noticed, passengers who didn't engage, who preferred to be left alone. But something about this man made her feel uneasy in a way she couldn't shake. Something about his presence seemed to be pulling the atmosphere tight, like a string stretched too far. She paused in the middle of the aisle for a moment, her eyes once again on the man. But as she stood there watching him, something shifted in her chest, like a strange sense of knowing, a feeling she couldn't explain, but it settled deep inside her. Just then the plane jolted again, but this time it wasn't the usual turbulence. It was sharp, sudden enough to make the air in the cabin thick, and passengers gasped and murmured nervously, their faces turning pale as the plane dipped and then steadied for a brief second. The flight attendant gripped the armrest of the seat in front of her, To steady herself, her stomach churned as she looked around, but the old man didn't flinch. His eyes never left the window. His hands remained steady on his lap. Not a muscle moved. It was almost as if he knew what was coming before it even happened. She thought to herself, a shiver crawling up her spine at the thought, but she quickly shook it off, dismissing it as nonsense. Still her feet moved of their own accord, and before she knew it she was standing beside him, her voice suddenly trembling slightly as she spoke. "Sir, are you all right?" This time he turned to look at her, his gaze slow but deliberate, and when he finally spoke his voice was deep and calm, as if nothing in the world could disturb the peace he had found. "I've been on this flight before," he said, his words measured and soft, but the weight of them landed heavy in the air. The flight attendant blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to hide the irritation creeping into her tone, but he didn't seem to notice. "The same route, the same airline, this plane," he said, looking out the window again. "I was once a part of a crew on this flight years ago, and I was supposed to be the one in charge of safety that day, but it didn't turn out that way." The flight attendant froze. The air around them seemed to become thicker, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. "What do you mean?" she repeated, but this time her voice wasn't as steady. His eyes didn't shift as he spoke again, each word slow, deliberate, like he was giving her a warning she wasn't ready for. "This flight had an accident years ago, a crash that should have taken everyone on board, but we survived by the grace of something I can't explain." Her breath caught in her throat. The plane seemed to groan under the weight of his words. The other passengers murmured nervously, unaware of the conversation unfolding, but it was like time slowed down in that moment. Did you cause the crash?" she asked before she could stop herself. His gaze turned to hers for the first time, truly meeting her eyes, and in that moment she felt a chill run through her veins. The man's gaze was like a storm, a calm before something terrible. "No," he said quietly, but with a weight that made her stomach drop. "But I couldn't save them." The words hung in the air between them like an unspoken truth. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy. The air in the cabin seemed to press down on her chest with every passing second. Her mind raced, trying to process the weight of his words, but nothing seemed to make sense. How could this old man be talking about a crash that happened years ago? And yet it felt like the truth was staring her in the face like a shadow she couldn't escape. She opened her mouth to ask him more, but before she could speak the plane jolted again. This time it was worse, much worse. The entire cabin shook violently, like the wings had been torn from the sky. Passengers screamed the sudden terror, filling the air as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, their faces twisted in fear as the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into a dark panic. The flight attendant's heart raced, her body frozen for a brief moment. As she tried to gather her thoughts, the chaos around her made everything feel distant, like she was underwater. The only thing that was clear was the sound of her own pulse pounding in her ears. But through the noise, through the chaos, she saw the old man again. His face was still eerily calm, and he was looking at her, watching her, like he knew exactly what to do. The sudden turbulence felt like it was never going to end. The plane dropped again, and then suddenly steadied, only to plummet once more. The screams around her intensified, but he remained unshaken, as if he was waiting for something to happen, something that he knew was inevitable. The flight attendant couldn't take it anymore. She turned to him, desperation flooding her voice. "What do you know? What's happening? Why is this happening?" The man looked at her slowly, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow, and for the first time she felt like she was staring into the face of someone who had seen the worst, the kind of man who had lived through the kind of terror she couldn't even imagine. "I know this flight," he said, his voice steady like the calm before a storm. "I know this plane. I've been on it before, and I know how it ends, if we don't change course." She blinked at him, confused. "Change course? What do you mean?" His eyes turned toward the cockpit, as if he were looking through the walls at something only he could see. His expression darkened, and then his voice dropped to a whisper. This flight was supposed to crash the first time, the same way it will crash now if we don't act. Her breath caught in her throat, the words barely making sense, but they echoed in her mind, like a warning she couldn't escape. What do you mean by act? She demanded, her voice shaking with fear and disbelief. The plane's trajectory is off, he said, his eyes narrowing as though he were seeing something in the distance. I don't know how or why, but this flight is headed for the same crash site I was a part of years ago, the exact same spot in the sky. The flight attendant's heart stopped. She looked around at the panic-stricken passengers, the terror in their eyes, the desperate cries of people she had never seen so afraid. But, how do you know this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned his gaze back to her, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Because I was there when it happened. I was on that plane. I survived, and I'm here now to make sure it doesn't happen again. She felt a cold chill crawl up her spine as the weight of his words hit her. The plane's engines roared louder than ever, the shaking growing more violent. And then there was a sound from the cockpit, a strange creak, a snap that sent a wave of panic rushing through her. Please, she said, her voice breaking as she rushed toward the cockpit door, you have to help us. But when she reached for the handle, her hand froze inches from it. The man's voice came again, his words like a whisper carried by the wind. It's too late to stop it now, but there's still time to change the course. The flight attendant stood frozen, her hand still hovering over the cockpit door, her mind racing, the weight of the man's words pressing down on her chest like a boulder. She felt the plane jolt again, as if it were trying to shake them both awake. The violent shake of the cabin was accompanied by a loud roar from the engines. The lights flickered back on for a brief moment, but it only made the chaos feel even more real, more immediate. She turned to look at the elderly man again. His eyes were fixed on her, and though his face was still calm, there was a deep sadness in his gaze, like he was already mourning the disaster he knew was coming. Why didn't you tell anyone before? She managed to choke out, her voice shaking. Why didn't you warn anyone? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted to the chaos in the cabin, the fear in the passengers' eyes, as they clung to their seats, gripping the oxygen masks above their heads. His face remained unchanged, but there was something there, something that told her he had seen this before. I tried, he said finally, his voice low but steady. I've tried to warn the crew every time I've been on this flight, but they don't believe me. They think I'm crazy. They think I'm just an old man stuck in the past. But I know what's happening. I know what's about to happen. His words hung in the air like an invisible weight. She couldn't shake the terror was rising in the cabin. The passengers were screaming now, the shrill cries of panic mixed with the violent shaking of the plane. It was all happening too fast, too out of control. She looked back at the cockpit, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had to do something. She had to make them listen. But the door to the cockpit remained locked. She felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Suddenly the old man stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, as though he were walking through the chaos, as if nothing in the world could faze him. He walked past her toward the front of the plane. The passengers shrank back at the sight of him. His presence was like a shadow that stretched across the cabin. His steps were quiet but purposeful. Without a word, he reached the front of the plane and looked back at the flight attendant, his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze that spoke volumes. There's no time to waste, he said simply. We have to get to the cockpit before it's too late. The flight attendant felt her breath catch in her throat, panic clawing at her chest. But something in his eyes, something about the certainty in his voice, made her move. She knew she had no choice. She had to follow him. Together, they rushed toward the cockpit with every step. She could feel the air growing heavier, the sound of the plane's engines roaring like a storm above them, the crew inside unaware of the impending danger. The old man reached the cockpit door, and without hesitation he placed his hand on the handle, his eyes narrowing as he looked back at her. "They're going to try to stop us," he warned, his voice low. "But we don't have time to argue." Just as he was about to open the door, the entire plane jolted violently once more, the lights flickered, and went out. This time the darkness was complete, the silence that followed was deafening. The flight attendant's heart raced. She couldn't breathe. Her fingers clung to the old man's sleeve as the world around her seemed to crash into chaos all at once. And then the voice of the captain came through the intercom, but it was wrong. His tone was calm, too calm, in the midst of the madness. "Everyone stay in your seats, we're going to be fine." The captain's voice echoed through the plane, but there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. "That's not the captain," he said simply. The cold truth hit her like a slap. She knew then that everything was wrong, everything was falling apart, and there was no turning back now. The cabin was silent except for the deep rumble of the engines, which now sounded ominous like thunder rolling through the sky. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the aisles as the flight attendant gripped the old man's sleeve tighter. Her pulse pounding in her ears, she felt the weight of everything bearing down on her too much, too fast. The intercom crackled again, but this time the voice was different. It was distorted, like someone was trying to disguise it. But she recognized the cold tone. "Everyone stay calm, remain seated." The voice said slowly, like it was meant to reassure, but only made the unease in her chest grow worse. The old man didn't flinch at the voice. He simply turned his head toward her and spoke in a low whisper. "That's not the captain. The man speaking is one of them." Her stomach turned at the words, but before she could respond, the old man moved swiftly toward the cockpit door, his pace steady and calm, as though he had been through this 1,000 times before. She followed him without thinking, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. But there was no time for answers, no time to ask why or how, just time to act. When they reached the cockpit door, the man placed his hand on the handle and hesitated for a split second, as if he were listening to something on the other side. The flight attendant's breath hitched. She felt like she was on the edge of a cliff, and if they weren't careful they would both fall. Suddenly there was a noise from inside, a muffled conversation. The sound of footsteps shuffling. The captain's voice had disappeared, and now all that remained was an eerie stillness. The old man took a deep breath and turned to her, his eyes sharp. "When I open this door, you have to be ready," he said, his voice low with urgency. "We don't know how many of them are in there, but we need to take control before it's too late." She nodded wordlessly, her heart racing, as the man twisted the door handle and pushed it open slowly. The hinges creaked in the silence as the door inched forward, and for a brief moment they both stood in the threshold of the cockpit, looking into the dimly lit room beyond. Inside there were two figures, seated in the captain's and co-pilot's chairs, their heads turned toward the monitors, but their faces were blank, their eyes glazed over, like they were no longer in control of their own bodies. The old man didn't hesitate. He stepped forward swiftly, and without warning he lunged toward the first figure, the one sitting in the captain's seat, his movements sharp and precise. The flight attendant could only watch in stunned silence as the man placed his hand firmly on the pilot's shoulder and with one smooth motion pulled the man out of his seat and onto the floor. The cockpit door slammed shut behind them, and the sudden change in the atmosphere made her lungs feel tight. She stepped forward to help, but the man stopped her with a raised hand, his eyes focused on the second figure, who was still sitting in the co-pilot's chair, unmoving. "That one is different," he whispered. "You stay back, let me handle it." She swallowed hard, her legs feeling like lead, but she obeyed, stepping back, just as the man advanced on the second figure, his hands steady and sure as he reached for the co-pilot's chair and spun it around to face him. The figure in the seat was completely still, its face shadowed by the low light of the cockpit, and for a moment everything seemed frozen in time as the old man locked eyes with the co-pilot. And then it happened. The figure's eyes snapped open. But they weren't eyes, they were cold hollow pits, dark and empty, like there was nothing left of the person who had once sat there. The man didn't flinch. Instead, his voice rang out clear and certain. "It's them," he said, his voice sharp and unwavering. "We've been hijacked by something far worse than we realize." The cockpit was thick with tension. As the man stood face to face with the co-pilot, his eyes locked onto the empty pits, where human expression used to reside. The flight attendant stood frozen just inside the door, her breath shallow, her hands trembling with the weight of the moment. She didn't know what was happening, what was going on, but the cold fear in her chest told her it wasn't good. The air around them felt thick and heavy, as though the very walls of the plane were closing in on them. The old man didn't move a muscle, his gaze never leaving the co-pilot's lifeless eyes. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, but then the silence was shattered by a low hum that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls of the aircraft, a vibration that made the floor beneath her feet tremble just slightly, but it was enough to make her stomach flip. The man finally spoke, his voice low and steady, but tinged with an urgency she had never heard before. "They've taken over the plane." He said his words slow, like he was letting them sink into her very bones. "These aren't the crew, these aren't people anymore." The flight attendant's chest tightened at his words, her throat dry and tight, as she tried to swallow the dread creeping into her mind. But the truth was there in front of her, in the hollow eyes of the co-pilot, in the unnatural calm of the old man standing in front of her. "What do you mean they've taken over?" She whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might make the situation worse. "They're not human anymore," he said again, his voice low and steady. But there was a trace of something else there, a flicker of fear. "These things have infiltrated the crew. They've taken control of the plane. They're using them as vessels to carry out something much bigger than us." She felt her blood run cold at his words. But before she could respond, the hum in the walls of the plane grew louder, vibrating through the very air around them, a sharp whine that seemed to pierce through her thoughts, making it hard to focus. It was like the sound was drilling into her skull, and for a moment she thought she might lose her mind. The old man's expression remained unchanged. He was watching the co-pilot, as though waiting for something to happen, the tension in the cockpit palpable. As the seconds ticked by, but nothing changed, the co-pilot remained still, staring into nothingness. And then it happened. Without warning, the co-pilot's hand jerked upward, as if controlled by some unseen force. It grabbed the controls of the plane with a grip that was unnaturally strong, and the plane lurched forward violently, as if it had suddenly lost all stability. The flight attendant stumbled back, her heart racing, as she reached for the back of the seat to steady herself. The old man didn't flinch, his eyes still locked on the co-pilot, as the plane jerked again, throwing them both to the side. "Their control is almost complete," he muttered under his breath, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. "We need to get to the emergency override. The autopilot is locked. We can't let them take us where they want to go." The flight attendant's mind raced with panic. She barely understood what was happening, but she understood enough to know they were running out of time. The plane was no longer in their control. The danger was closing in on them faster than she could think. She turned to him, desperation rising in her chest. "Where do we go? What do we do?" she asked, her voice cracking under the weight of the fear flooding her body. He didn't answer right away, but his eyes flicked to the window for a split second, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something dark and knowing. "We have to find the control room," he said, his voice steady as ever. "That's the only place left where we might have a chance to stop them." Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew there was no other option, no other choice. They had to act now, or the plane would be lost forever. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight with fear, as she followed him out of the cockpit and into the hallway of the plane. As they moved through the darkened cabin, the chaos of the passengers had only grown louder. The fear was palpable. People were panicking, crying out desperately for answers. But there was no time to calm them, no time to explain. They had to focus on stopping the plane from reaching its final destination. Every step felt like it took them further away from safety, further into the unknown, as the sound of the plane's engines roared louder. Their destination, a header place they could only hope might hold the key to saving them all. They moved swiftly through the narrow aisles of the plane, the flight attendant's heart hammering in her chest. Every sound around her felt amplified, the distant cries of panic from the passengers, the hum of the engines growing louder, as though they were reaching a breaking point. The old man moved ahead of her, with purpose, his steps steady, but his eyes darting from side to side as though expecting something to leap out at them from the shadows. Every part of her wanted to turn back to check on the passengers, but she couldn't. There was no time for hesitation, no time to consider anything other than what they had to do next. As they neared the back of the plane, she could hear the rattling of something metallic in the distance, the sound like a door being slammed shut, or perhaps locked from the inside. She didn't know, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The old man didn't slow his pace. He reached a small door near the rear of the plane and paused, his hand hovering just above the handle for a brief moment, his face hardening with determination. "This is it," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to get inside before they realize we're coming." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't ask what they would find inside. She didn't want to know. But she nodded anyway, her hands trembling as she stepped beside him, ready for whatever came next. With a quick motion, he twisted the handle and pushed the door open, the sharp screech of the hinges echoing through the dark cabin. They stepped into a dimly lit room. It was small, cramped, with strange equipment and blinking lights that cast a cold green glow across the walls. For a moment, everything felt eerily still, as though the room itself were holding its breath. And then she saw it, the figure standing in front of the control panel, the figure that had been lurking behind the glass, the one she had seen only in brief flashes of light, its body twisted unnaturally, like it was barely holding itself together. It turned to face them, its eyes dark and hollow, like pits of nothingness, its mouth stretched into a grin that didn't reach its eyes. "You're too late." The voice came not from the mouth, but from everywhere all around them, filling the room like a creeping fog. The flight attendant froze, her blood turning to ice. The old man stepped forward, his face grim but resolute. "We'll see about that," he muttered. The creature didn't move at first, its hollow eyes flicking toward the console, as though it were waiting for them to make the next move. The silence stretched on, and then the old man lunged forward with lightning speed, his hands slamming down onto the control panel. In front of him, the creature's eyes locked onto him, its grin growing wider. "Don't you see?" the creature hissed, its voice now cold and mocking. "This isn't about control, this is about purpose. We were never meant to live in this world. We've only been waiting to take it back." The flight attendant could feel the chill in the air as the creature's words seemed to seep into her very bones. She took a step back, her body on edge. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in around her. But the old man didn't waver, his eyes fixed on the panel as he began pressing buttons and switches, his hands moving with practiced speed and precision, his voice a low murmur to himself as he worked. "I've seen this before, I know how to stop it." The creature made a sudden move, its hands outstretched toward the old man, its fingers twitching like claws ready to strike. But the old man was faster. He reached the final switch and slammed it down with a sharp motion. For a brief moment, everything went dark. The hum of the plane's engines cut off, and the strange buzzing stopped, the world holding its breath in that single moment. And then the lights flickered back on the control panel, buzzed with life, and the creature's grin faltered, as though something were wrong, something it hadn't anticipated. The old man turned to the flight attendant, his eyes tired but steady. "It's not over yet, but we've got a fighting chance now." But even as he spoke, the room began to shake again. the walls vibrating with a low growl, as though the plane itself were waking up from a deep slumber. And then they heard it, the sound of something moving outside the room, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer with each passing second. The flight attendant's heart raced as the air in the room grew colder and heavier. She could feel the tension tightening like a vice around her chest. She turned to the old man. His expression was grim, his eyes never leaving the control panel. As he took a slow step toward the door, his hand resting on the wall beside him, the sound of the footsteps outside becoming unmistakably clear. They were getting closer with a purpose. The creature had fallen silent, but its presence loomed like a shadow over them, its hollow eyes glinting in the dim light, its twisted grin still frozen on its face, as though it were waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next move to unfold. The old man's fingers twitched, and for a split second the flight attendant wondered if he was about to give in to the fear that was creeping through her as well. But then he spoke, his voice low, steady. "Whatever happens next, we have to stay calm. Don't let them see your fear." She nodded, her throat tight, but she managed to find her voice. "What do we do now?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes focused on the door as the footsteps outside grew louder, until it felt as though the entire plane was about to break apart at the seams, the vibrations in the walls deepening, as though something was pushing against them from the other side. "We fight," the old man said suddenly, his voice firm with a finality that took her by surprise. He stepped away from the panel and moved toward the small emergency kit that hung beside the wall. His hands moved quickly as he grabbed 2 items, a flare gun and a set of small explosive charges. "Are you crazy?" she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew they didn't have a choice. This was their only chance. He turned to her, his eyes sharp. "We don't have the luxury of time. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." She watched him as he began preparing the explosive charges with a calmness that made her uneasy, but there was no time to question him. She just had to trust that he knew what he was doing. The footsteps were almost at the door now, and she could feel the air grow thicker with each passing second. She glanced back at the control panel. Everything seemed stable now, but they were still in danger. The creature was still in control of something far bigger than them. "Are you ready?" the old man asked, his voice low, as he grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the door. She nodded, though her entire body was trembling. She could barely hear her own thoughts over the pounding of her heart. But somehow she found herself standing beside him as he positioned the explosive charges at the base of the door. He looked at her one last time before setting the fuse. "When this blows, you need to move fast. Don't stop for anything." The moment the words left his mouth, the door shook violently, the footsteps on the other side, now louder than ever, as if something was pressing against the door, trying to break through. They had only seconds to react. The old man pulled the trigger on the flare gun, and the bright light illuminated the room for a brief moment, blinding them both with a sudden flash of color. And then the explosion came. The door was blown off its hinges in a burst of smoke and fire. The force of the blast sent them both crashing to the floor, but the flight attendant didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged, as the old man pulled her up and shoved her toward the narrow corridor ahead. They ran blindly through the darkened cabin, the sound of the chaos growing louder with every step, as the passengers screamed in terror behind them. But they had no time to look back, no time to think, only time to act. The control room was just ahead. They could see the flashing lights, the dim glow of the instruments, still blinking in the dark. They were almost there, almost at the heart of everything that had gone wrong. And then they saw it, the figure standing at the far end of the hallway, its hollow eyes glowing in the darkness, its twisted body moving toward them with an unnatural grace. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat as she realized what they were facing wasn't just a hijacker. It was something far worse. It was a force beyond human comprehension. "Run," the old man whispered, his voice shaking for the first time since this nightmare began. They didn't stop, they didn't look back. As they raced toward the control room, the door was just ahead. But the creature was getting closer, its footsteps echoing in the empty cabin like the sound of doom approaching. And just as they reached the door, the lights flickered one last time, plunging the entire plane into darkness. And then there was nothing but the sound of their own breaths and the scream of the thing behind them. The door slammed shut behind them, just as the creature's claws reached for them, and in that instant everything went quiet.